Welcome to the Write Better Fiction podcast, the show that helps you, well, write better fiction. I'm Shane Miller, urban fantasy author, writing coach, and story geek, and each week I'll be talking to industry experts about the writing craft, publishing, and the business of being an author. Enjoy the show. Hello, fictioneers, and welcome to episode 22 of the Write Better Fiction podcast. Today, I'm chatting to Alex Kourvo, the author of the Big Picture Revision Checklist, all about revising your novel, so stay tuned for that. But now it's time for Question of the Week. Last week's question from How to Build Fictional Worlds with Angeline Trevina was, what's your favourite thing about world building? I haven't had any responses to this question just yet, but when responses start flowing in, I will read them out on the show. This week's question is, what's your favourite thing about revising your novel? Okay, now it's time for my update from the writing chair. Last week, I said I was drafting and I was really excited about it. Well, that excitement has stuck with me this week. So I'm recording this at the weekend, it's Sunday. Yesterday, I sat down and for the first time in a long time, I managed to block off the entire day just to write. And I wrote 8,700 words yesterday. And what is weird for me is that I enjoyed drafting every single one of those words. If you've listened to the show for a long time, you know that I hate drafting, or I did. And I even appeared on the Indie Author podcast with previous guest Matty Dalrymple talking about how much I hate first drafting. And I really didn't used to enjoy the drafting process. This time I'm enjoying it. I'm working in a way that works for me and I'm so much more productive. We often hear the advice that you shouldn't go back and edit as you go. And I stuck to that advice for years and I would plow through the first draft and not go back and fix anything. But what that meant is that my brain was always stuck on those mistakes that I knew existed and that I knew I was going to have to fix anyway, because I outline, I don't tend to change my plot much in the drafting phase. So it's quicker for me and more productive for me to go back and have a light editing phase as I draft. So I'm drafting 2 chapters at a time. I'm going back and doing a light edit on those 2 chapters. And the story is so fresh in my mind at that point that there's less editing to do. But my point is my productivity is up because I can move on to the next chapter and I'm not thinking about the mistakes I made in the last one. And I want to be clear here, I'm not bothered about spelling mistakes when I do this light edit in my first draft. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about story-specific things that I know I'll need to fix whatever happens in the draft, whatever changes in the draft. There are some fundamental things that I know I'm always going to need to go back and fix. So for me, it makes me quicker and more productive to go back and do that as I'm writing. That won't work for everyone, and the advice just to do a shitty first draft will work for some people. If that works for you, don't change to my process just because I'm saying it works for me. We all have to work in ways that work best for us. If you want early access to episodes and exclusive access to the Fictioneer community on Discord, where you can participate in things like weekly accountability and question of the week, you can support the show on Patreon for as little as $5 a month. Head over to patreon.com/writebetterfiction. And when I reach 50 patrons, I'm going to start recording a monthly Q&A for patrons only to answer all your writerly questions. Okay, that's about it from me, so let's get into the interview with Alex. Hello, and welcome to the Write Better Fiction podcast. Today, I'm joined by Alex Kourvo. Alex Kourvo is a freelance editor with over a decade of experience helping writers. She lives in a college town in Michigan on the perfect street in the perfect house. I love that. Besides books, her favorite things in the world are sunbeams and key lime pie. I'm also a fan of key lime pie. Hi, Alex. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. So if we could start then by you telling us a little bit about you and your journey into editing.
I have a degree in English, and when I first started editing, I was editing for a small press, as well as also editing for private clients. And I discovered very quickly that I much prefer the freelance editing. I much prefer dealing one-on-one with authors. When I was working for the press, I always felt like I had I was always sort of in two minds. Part of me wanted to, was on the writer's side, and I was really trying to help them achieve their vision. But then I also had these other considerations of who is signing my paycheck, and what are their priorities, and what are their deadlines, and that kind of thing. So nowadays I am just a freelance editor, and I absolutely love it. I am a developmental editor, which means that I am looking at things like plot and characterization and pacing and scene development and all those big picture issues that you have to get right before you go into copy editing and proofreading.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And speaking of developmental editing, we're here to talk about your fantastic book, which I can see you've got in the background there, the Big Picture Revision Checklist. That cover really stands out too, so that was a great pick. Can you explain the concept behind the Big Picture Revision Checklist and how it benefits writers in their revision process?
Yeah. So when an editor, or sorry, when a writer finishes their first draft, a lot of writers become lost at that moment. They don't know where to begin with their editing. They don't know what steps they should be taking with their editing. And so I wanted to help authors sort of create a system so that they're not overwhelmed and they're not trying to do everything at once, where they can just say, oh, okay, this is the first thing I have to do. This is the second thing I have to do. So it's called the Big Picture Revision Checklist. But of course, the book is much more than a checklist. It also has instruction and it has examples. And I'm really hoping that it becomes sort of this system for writers to use step by step when they're doing that first big revision that they have to do.
Yeah, and that's really tricky. I remember when I finished my first novel, and I am a developmental editor now too, but then I wasn't, and I didn't have any idea how to start. So you'd focus on prose or something, but what's the point if you're going to have to cut that scene because it doesn't fit with your story, right?
Exactly, exactly. You have to start by looking at the book as a whole and say, what does this entire book need before you start looking at individual scenes or individual paragraphs.
Yeah, definitely. Brilliant. So, what are the common pitfalls then that authors usually encounter during the novel revision process, or things that you've noticed? And how does your book or your advice help them navigate these issues?
I think one thing that you touched on was that authors try to focus on the sentence by sentence writing first. And I think that the reason that writers fall into that trap is because it's easier to look at the sentence by sentence writing. You can take an awkward sentence and rewrite it into a beautiful sentence, and that feels really good for your ego, and it's very easy to do, and you're like, oh, I accomplished something here. So so by looking at, by constantly looking at those smaller issues instead of the bigger ones, then a lot of writers are just spinning their wheels. And another mistake I think that writers make is that they try to edit their books chronologically. They want to start with chapter one, and they say, okay, I'm going to fix chapter one and I'm going to make it as good as I can. And I'm going to make it so polished. And then when that's done, I'm going to go on to chapter two, and I'm going to polish chapter one and chapter two. And then I'm going to polish chapter three, but oops, now I got to go back to chapter one and polish it again. And so a lot of writers end up in this unproductive loop where they're just constantly looping back to their first chapter because they haven't really been taught any other way to do it. I teach a class for beginning writers at my public library. And so I talk to a lot of writers that are, in every stage of their writing journey. And I can see very clearly where the gaps are in their education. And so, there are a lot of writers, they study how-to books, they've been to writing classes, but there's this gap between the first draft and the finished draft. And that second draft in between is just a mystery to them. So I really wanted to help with that big second draft editing that writers have to do.
Yeah, and you're right there. It does feel mysterious when you're new because nobody really talks about it. I think this is one of only maybe no, I think your book is the most unique in terms of this approach. So yeah, it was, like I said, great book, but you're right. It feels very mysterious and nobody really knows how to do it until somebody shows them, which is great. So how you mentioned kind of editing order there, but how do you recommend that writers use your book? Should they read it from front to back? Can they pick and choose sections as they need to? What's your best advice for that?
Well, of course, I would be super happy if writers would read the entire thing front to back, and to be fair, the book itself is only a little over 100 pages long. So you definitely could read it very quickly and then start putting it into use. But writers are going to do what they want. So if somebody that has the book and they only want to read the chapter about characterization, or they only want to read the chapter about, plotting, hey, that's great too.
Yeah, anything that's going to help, right? I suppose.
Right.
Cool. So you spoke about characterization there, and one of the things that I loved that you discussed in Big Picture was making likable protagonists who are flawed in exactly the right ways. And it was in the exactly the right ways bit that got me. So can you give some tips on striking the balance between flawed but doing it right?
Yeah, this is a problem that a lot of writers have. And I think that making a well-rounded, three-dimensional character is actually easy. It's actually one of the easiest things to do, but I think writers tend to overcomplicate it in a way that they really don't have to do. Um, you start with your character's strengths, and I think that's a really great place to start. We love our heroes and heroines, and so we want to give them admirable qualities. We want them to be intelligent and compassionate and wise and interesting. But then we say, okay, now I've got this character with all these really positive characteristics, but I know I also need to give this character some flaws so that they're well-rounded. But that's when writers sometimes trip themselves up because they start throwing in random flaws that don't have anything to do with the book, and they don't have anything to do with the character. So if you've made your, hero intelligent and compassionate and wise, but then you're like, oh, I got to give him some flaws. So I'm going to make sure that he's always late for everything, or he's really clumsy, or, he leaves dirty dishes in the sink. And it's like, what does that have to do with the story? And what does that have to do with the character? But make it easy on yourself. The place to look for your character's flaws is in their strengths, because every strength has a downside. So let's say that you've made your character's strength like he's really intelligent. Let's say that's his strength. Well, the downside of that is that he's also probably really arrogant, and he probably doesn't listen to other people's advice. And then you've got a character like Sherlock Holmes, right? Or maybe you have a character who's really, really independent, and that is her great strength. And the downside of that, the flaw that goes with that, is she's probably not very good at asking for help when she needs it, and gets herself in all kinds of trouble because she's not asking for help when she really should. And then you've got a character like Stephanie Plum then in the Janet Ivanovich mysteries. So it's very easy to just combine those two things, the strengths and the flaws, and just make sure that one of them is the flip side of the other. And then you're very easily going to have a well-rounded character just kind of naturally.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice, because we always look, like you said, sometimes flaws can feel a bit tacked on, but if you look at the strengths first, you'll see natural weaknesses in there, I guess.
Right. You can even do it the other way around. You can
Hmm.
start with their flaws and then say, well, what is the upside of the flaw that I'm giving the character?
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so moving on from character to plot then. In the book, you talk about 5 crucial scenes that every novel needs. So can you explain a bit about what those are and why they're necessary as well?
The 5 crucial scenes that every novel needs. It and it really is every single novel, every single time. There really aren't any exceptions to this. The first scene that every novel needs is the hook. This is the scene that's at the very beginning of your novel. This is the opening scene. And the temptation with a lot of writers is to dump a bunch of backstory into the opening scene, or just have the character sitting alone in a room thinking. But you don't want that kind of static opening. You want an opening that's dynamic. You want an opening that's in movement, and the character is already sort of in trouble in some kind of way. And that's what's going to draw the reader in. The second scene that every novel has to have is a scene about 20% of the way into the book that is called, sometimes it's called plot point 1, sometimes it's called the inciting incident, sometimes it's called the break into act 2. But this is the scene that really propels the hero or heroine on their story journey. So if you think about, let's say, for example, The Wizard of Oz, this is the scene where Dorothy first sets foot on the yellow brick road and starts heading toward the Emerald City. Or if you think about the Hunger Games, this is where Katniss is volunteers for the games, and gets put on a train and shipped off to the capital city. It's you have to make that scene a big enough break from the ordinary world that the hero or heroine can't go back. Once they've made that decision, they can't undo the decision that they've made. So once Dorothy starts heading toward the Emerald City, there's no other way home. She can't get home to Kansas any other way. So it has to feel like sort of like the doorway is closing behind them, so they can't change their mind. The next scene that every single novel has to have is a midpoint scene. And just like the name, it comes at the exact middle of a book. And this is the scene that is full of action and emotion and drama. It's full of action because things are happening on the page, or they should be. It's full of drama because it spins the plot into a brand new direction. And it's full of emotion because the characters in the book really feel very deeply about what's happening at this moment. So if you can make a really, really strong midpoint scene, it can act like a tent pole, and it can hold up your entire novel. And you'll never have a sagging middle again. Just as a side note, I was teaching a workshop once and I was talking about the midpoint scene and how it's crucial for every book. And I told the writers that you should just go home, go to your bookshelf and pull any random book off the shelf, any published novel at all. Just pull it off the shelf and open to the exact middle page and see what's happening on the page. And one of the authors contacted me later and she said, I thought you were wrong about that, but I pulled book after book off the shelf and every single one had a strong scene right at the midpoint. And I'm like, told you, I told you. Yeah. So yeah, I would challenge you to try it for yourself. Just pull random books off your shelf and see what's happening at the midpoint. And I guarantee you it will be full of action, emotion, and drama. So the next scene that every single novel has to have is the all is lost moment. And this is the moment that usually happens around 3/4 of the way through the book. And this is the moment that the hero or heroine feels like everything is lost. They feel like they've been defeated. They feel like they cannot go on. And they're just at their emotionally low point in the novel. And then the fifth scene that every book needs is, of course, the climax scene that happens at the end. And the really important thing to know about a climax scene is that whatever stakes you set up at the beginning of the novel, whatever is at stake for your hero or heroine, those stakes have to be resolved in the climax. It can be a happy ending, it can be a sad ending, but whatever, it must be some sort of resolution. I like to say that books need to end. They can't just stop.
Yes.
So those are the 5 scenes.
And that's pretty solid advice for sure, especially about the book having to end. I hadn't asked you this question in advance, but as we're talking about books ending, how do authors handle that in a series? So say they've wrapped up the conflict in one book, but they want to entice their reader to go to the next book in the series. What would happen then?
So this is what you often see in long-running series. So getting back to the concept of story stakes, you have set up things to be at stake for your main character. And there's the outer stakes, there's whatever is happening in the plot to make them, have a happy ending. And then there's the inner stakes. So it's, what's going on inside of them mentally, emotionally, or spiritually. So those two kinds of stakes are always present in every book. And what you often see in long-running series is that the external stakes will change from book to book. So if it's a mystery series, there'll be a new murder to solve in every book. Or if it's like an urban fantasy series, there will be a new monster to defeat in every book. But the internal stakes tend to carry over from book to book in a long-running series. So we mentioned before the Stephanie Plum books by Janet Ivanovich, and those are about a bounty hunter, and she is sort of learning the ropes as far as bounty hunting. And so in every book, she has a new bounty that she has to hunt and catch. But her internal stakes are that she is struggling with adulthood. She kind of doesn't know how to adult very well. And so those stakes carry through from book to book to book. And she's struggling with the internal stakes all through the series. So what I like to say is that when the external stakes are resolved, the book is over. And when the internal stakes are resolved, the series is over.
Right. Really simple way to look at it rather than the
Yeah.
things that we usually hear. That's great. So in your experience then, what is the most challenging part about revising a novel from the story perspective? Because that's what we're looking at. And how can writers prepare themselves to be in a good position to overcome that challenge?
I think the hardest part about that big second edit that you have to do is that a lot of writers kind of don't, well, they get overwhelmed. They don't they're not emotionally ready to tackle this big of a project, and it is a big project. And so they do one of two things. One, they get overwhelmed and they say, I can't do it. And I need to go hire an editor to do it for me, even though that's not how that works. Or they try to they try to what am I trying to say? I don't know. They get overwhelmed. They try to then go back to that chronological thing that we talked about before because it's easier. So they never tackle the entire thing as a whole. The other thing that I think that writers tend to do is they tend to not set aside enough time for the revision. A lot of writers will set aside big chunks of time to work on their rough drafts because they know that it takes a lot of like butt in chair time to finish the book. But then they kind of think, oh, the edits, they'll take care of themselves, or they think, oh, the edits will I can sort of do them in my spare time. I can just do 10 minutes here or 15 minutes there with the edits because it's not that hard or something. And what they don't realize is that they have to set aside those same big chunks of time for editing as they did for the writing. Because the editing, it takes a lot of focused work to do, and you cannot just do it haphazardly, and you can't just do it 10 minutes here, 15 minutes there. You have to really take the time to do it. The other thing I think that writers run into is that there isn't a lot of social support for the editing process. So when you're writing your rough draft, you can go on to Facebook or Twitter or Mastodon or any social media, and you can type, I wrote 750 words today, or I wrote 1,500 words today, or however many words that you wrote. And no matter what number you put down, all of your friends will just give you so much credit for that. You'll get all the likes and you'll get all the thumbs ups, and your friends will say, that's great, keep going, you're doing so well. But then when it comes to the editing process, if you were to go onto your social media and say, well, I cut 500 words today, or you were to say like, well, I figured out my midpoint scene today, or maybe you would say like, well, I had to completely rethink my villain's motivation today, you would get crickets. Your friends and family would not know how to respond to that. Like they might say, well, I think that's good. I'm not really sure if it is. So you don't get that same social support that you get when you're doing that rough draft and you're just piling up the word count all the time. It's just, editing is so hard to quantify and so hard to measure. So I think that is another problem that comes with editing. So I think that kind of goes hand in hand with not setting aside the time for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think the crucial thing you said there, which made me laugh because I come across it a lot too, is that people don't set aside enough time to do the edit. So they think that the first draft is the hard bit, which is not easy. I'm not saying it is, but to actually go back and refine a story it's a completely different mindset and a completely different set of skills, really, to just writing.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so writers often ask me how they know their novel is ready to send to a professional editor. So we're looking at, you've done your self edits, you might have done a little copy edit, and you don't quite know whether it's ready. So have you got any tips for knowing when your book is ready, or at least knowing when to let it go?
Yeah, that's a hard one. That's a hard one. I would say the vast majority of the time, writers seek out a professional editor too soon. They get overwhelmed, they get fed up, they say, I can't look at this anymore, and they send it off, and it'll come to me and it'll just be way too early. I always say that an editor is like rocket fuel. So, if you give me a rocket that is streamlined and aerodynamic and powerful and ready to go, I'm going to add that rocket fuel and it is going to soar into space. But if you give me a rocket that is half built and it has things falling off of it and none of the bolts are tightened, then if I pour rocket fuel on that, it's just going to burn to a crisp on the launch pad. So you want to make sure that you are giving your editor a book that you have taken just as far as you can on your own. So I would advise you that you do that first round of edits on your own, and then you give it to your beta readers. And you have your beta readers look it over. You give them time to do that. And that time is good for you as the writer too, because I always say that time is the best editor. You are going to see things that you didn't see a month ago when you gave it to your betas. So you're going to give it to your beta readers. They're going to come back with their suggestions, and you're going to go through it and edit it again with that beta reader feedback. And only then should you seek out professional edits or be ready to send it off to a publisher if you're going the traditional route.
Yeah, great advice. So this is the Write Better Fiction podcast, and I usually ask my guests why they write fiction, but I'll ask you something slightly different, being as you're an editor. So, Alex Kourvo, why do you edit fiction?
I love books and I love book people. And my editing business is my service to the community. These writers that I work with, they have been carrying these books around in their hearts. And my job, if I do my job correctly, is to take those books of their heart and turn it into something that they can share with the world. And I think that that is just the best job ever.
Oh, I love that. That's great. And a great way to close out the show. So can you tell everyone a little bit about where they can find more about you and everything that you do?
You can find out more about me and my how-to books and my editing services on my website. It's alexkourvo.com, and Kourvo is spelled Kourvo. I'm also on social media, but like everybody else nowadays, my social media is a little bit in flux. So probably the best place to find me is on my website, and I have links to my socials there.
Great. Thanks for coming on the show, Alex. That was fantastic.
Well, thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed the interview with Alex and picked up a ton of actionable tips on revising your novel. Join me next week when I'll be chatting to urban fantasy authors JP Reinfleisch and AB Cohen all about co-writing fiction. Have a great writing week. Thanks for listening to the Write Better Fiction podcast. Remember to hit subscribe on your favourite podcatcher and leave a review, and we'll chat again next time.